Okay, so for our last talk, we'll have Nathan from Argonne. He's going to present improving performance portability on procedurally generated high energy physics. Okay.
Hi. So this is going to be kind of a case study, I guess, of a high energy physics code that has been ported to SYCL, or at least portions of the code have been ported to SYCL. And so yeah, so let's get started. Hold on a second. There we go. All right. So so first I'll talk a little bit about what MadGraph actually is. So that's the application that I was working on. And then I'll give a kind of a high level overview of how the code is generated and the kernel itself that we ported. And then we'll look inside the guts a little bit of the code so I can discuss maybe why it's a kind of a tough code to optimize for the GPU. And then I'll show some performance scaling results on various architectures. And I'll put like a special note about using SYCL vector types to achieve good performance on CPU. And then finally, I'll show some large scale results on some of the HPC machines that we have at Argonne. So what is MadGraph? Well, MadGraph is an event generator. That's a computational tool that's used in the field of high energy physics for simulating the interactions of particles at high energies, such as those encountered at the Large Hadron Collider. It specializes in automated generation of Feynman diagrams and the calculation of scattering amplitudes for processes involved in the collisions of particles. These amplitudes I just mentioned are essential for predicting the probabilities of various outcomes from particle collisions. So I basically use MadGraph to predict the outcomes of particle collisions in the experiments, which then helps physicists to design experiments and interpret data that's collected from the particle detectors. Researchers can also use MadGraph to explore the implications of theoretical models and test their predictions on the models and compare those results against experimental results. So sort of like a theory guides experiment, experiment guides theory kind of thing. So in short, MadGraph and other event generators they play a pivotal role in high energy physics, and they kind of bridge the gap between theoretical models and experimental observation. So I got a picture here of a Feynman diagram that can be produced by the MadGraph code or particle collisions that it's simulated. So what are sort of the inputs and outputs of MadGraph? So the kind of the most important input is the process definition here. And so that tells you what kind of particles you want to be interacting. So maybe you want to collide an electron with a positron or two gluons or whatever. And then whatever gets output from that collision is also part of that process definition. There's also, you can choose the theoretical model. So either you're using a standard model or some other models like supersymmetry model or whatever you want to use. And then there's also some parameter settings that you can tune. So you can change kind of physical constants or the energy scale that you're at. There's also runtime parameters. So that's like how many events do you want to calculate, or what is the energy scale that you want to run at. And then finally, there's the cuts and selection criteria. So that is basically you can choose. That's based on the detector you're using. So sometimes the detector's a certain shape, so you can only detect certain things. So you want to put that criteria in the MadGraph code. So all those get put into a Python interface that we have. And then the Python interface procedurally generates the code based off of all those inputs. And it spits out some Fortran code. And then it also spits out some SYCL or CUDA or C++ code. So, and then it compiles that code. And so the SYCL, CUDA, C++ code, what that code does, it does what's called matrix element calculation. And so they did some studies to try to figure out, okay, what do we want to accelerate on the event generators? Well, they found out that the matrix element calculation portion of the code was taking up a significant amount of the runtime. So it's like 80% of the runtime or something like that. So it was a good candidate to just isolate that code and accelerate that on the GPU. And so what we do is we compile a library that's called by a C++ library that's called by the Fortran code in order to have the two interact with each other. And the outputs that you get are these things that are called event files, which are probably the most important part of the code. You can take those event files, which has basically results from the collisions, and use that for further processing for the physics experiments. Also outputs cross sections, which is those are the probability for the collision to occur. And as I mentioned, it also does the Feynman diagrams. And you can also get some other things from the code as well. One thing I used the cross sections for was to determine whether the code was actually running quickly without having to go in and look at all the event files. Anyway, so let's take a look kind of at a high level view of what the kernels kind of look like for some of the physics processes that we were tracking. Now, keep in mind that the physics processes are general, so you can choose any kind of collision that you want. So the MadGraph code outputs basically a really fat kernel. And we kept track of basically 5 different physics processes that were increasingly computationally complex. And it's only this bottom one that's really scientifically relevant. But so what's happening here is as we increase the computational complexity, you can see that each one of these lines are actually a function in themselves, and they also call other functions, and the outputs of those functions are required for other functions. And we need to, so you might say to yourself, well, why don't you just cut across here, right? Or cut across and have multiple kernel submissions. Well, that's because in the other physics processes, it's the flow control graphs aren't as clean as this one. So in order to keep things general, we have to have a fat kernel. And anyway, what the point I'm trying to make here is that for the scientific relevant cases, you can see that we're generating on the fly all these internal functions in here. So it's like thing that says FFV1 and FFV1_2 and all this stuff in here is being generated on the fly. And the FFV1 inside here is different than the FFV1 in here. So it's like we don't have those functions already made. So we can't go in and hyper optimize them. And so what's happening is with all these spaghetti strings that are coming across is that for the scientifically relevant case, you see that there's a 2,274 extra generated function calls. But after inlining all these extra functions that are inside the code, we end up with a kernel that's like 1 million lines long. So it's extremely huge. So that's tough with compilers, right? And that's tough to optimize. But we were able to get the code working, both CUDA and in SYCL. And let me talk a little bit about the environment that it tested on. So you see we tested on a whole bunch of different devices. We got NVIDIA devices in the mix and some AMD devices. We also test on the CPU, which is important for the folks back at CERN, because a lot of the clusters that they have access to are CPU only. And then we also have some tests that we did on Aurora and our test system for Aurora, Sunspot, and Polaris as well. And you may have noticed that I got some of the software tools listed up here that we use. I have 2 different versions of CUDA listed here. That's because the version of CUDA that we had installed on Polaris was, it was whatever was there. So we have 11.4 there at the time. And we had 11.8 at the time I did these tests on our JLSC test bed. And for Aurora and Sunspot, at least, Intel provided us access to early access to experimental builds of DBC++ that we could use on those systems. So I'm going to show results for basically the easiest, computationally easiest kernel that we had, and then also show one for a more computationally complex kernel. So across the board, we were able to achieve a pretty decent performance. So I show performance results here for native CUDA implementation, OpenMP implementation that we have on top of the CPU, and also for the SYCL version of the code as well. And you can see that we have a pretty comparable performance on the A100 and the V100 to the native CUDA implementation. This EE to mu process is the computationally simple process. Everything worked out pretty well there. And on the CPU, we were able to achieve a significant performance boost over the OpenMP implementation of our code. But as we increase the complexity of the code, so I think this is like a couple 100,000 lines is the kernel. And we also suffer from a huge amount of register spills in the code. there starts to be some drop in the performance on some of the devices. So we're still pretty good performance on the NVIDIA devices. In fact, we outcompete the CUDA native version of the code on the NVIDIA devices, but we have a drastic reduction in the performance on the AMD devices and Intel devices in comparison to the NVIDIA devices. You can also notice if you look at the y-axis comparing these two, right? So we're like calculating 10 to the 9th matrix elements per second here on this easy one, but in this more complicated one, we're a factor of 1,000 less in terms of how many matrix elements we're able to calculate per second. So how did I get those? Well, I did some parameter tuning or parameter optimization in the code. So on the x-axis here, this is kind of the events per iteration is what we call it, but it's really the total threads launched essentially. And so we had some tuning parameters where we were able to tune the work group size and the total number of work groups. And here I'm just showing the plot for the best result. I did a 3-dimensional grid search essentially for those parameters. You'll notice at least on the Intel PVC GPU, we're able to achieve better performance eventually. This jump here happens just after saturation of the thread count. So after we fill the GPU with a certain amount of threads, we get a jump in performance. We're still investigating what this jump came from. We haven't quite pinpointed why we're able to get that jump in performance yet. And then for the more complex process, as I mentioned before, you can see that we have this consistent reduction in performance just across the board on other devices. So if I pulled up the plots for AMD, you'll see a similar thing as well, where we're just consistently below the performance of the A100 results, or the ratio of performance, I would say. So if you look at the ratio of the performance for the simple one versus the ratio for the more complex ones, you'll notice that there's a huge performance degradation. So what about performance on the CPU? Well, I had mentioned that the CERN people are interested in having performance, good performance on the CPU as well. So in order to keep the code upstreamable, if it's not performing on the CPU, then we're not going to get it upstreamed into the maggraph repo. So in order to achieve this, so if we used primitive data types in our code, we were not performing on the CPU. It was really bad. So I'll show that next. But because the code is very, very complex, we weren't able to achieve the vectorization that you might expect on the CPU. So we couldn't rely on traditional techniques like function widening or auto vectorization, stuff like that. So as a kind of an ad hoc or hacky way in order to get that performance, we dropped in SYCL vector type into the code. And for us, it was pretty easy. So we just have these type defs that I show here on the screen. And we also have the complex types that we could choose the different complex number library that we're using. And we just drop in the SYCL vector inside that. Now, I say it was pretty easy. There's also obviously some things that we had to change as well in the code. So like we couldn't use ternaries, right? We had to do like SYCL select, and there's other functions, right? That you have to do some tweaking of the code in order to get it to work. But performance-wise, right, because a vector of dimension 1 is essentially the same as a primitive data type, there's basically no performance if you just leave the dimension set to 1. So what does the performance look like here? So if you force the application to be single-threaded, you can see that we get about what you might expect as you increase the vectorization level, right? So these are all normalized to the throughput for the best result on the primitive data type. You can see if you double the performance, you get, or you double the vector size, you get almost double the performance. And if you quadruple it, you get 4 times the performance, and not quite 8 times the performance if you go up to a vector size of 8 in our code. What's important to note is that we're able to, if you're in the single-threaded mode, outcompete the performance of the OpenMP version of the code, which also uses vector intrinsics in order to get the performance on the vectorization of the code. So that also doesn't rely on auto vectorization as well. Now what happens if you let don't force it to be single threaded because you're going to lose a lot of performance by doing that. So if you don't force it to be single threaded, you see that the OpenMP it's outcompetes up to a certain point. Then eventually, using sickle vector type wins out in performance. And the important thing to note here is that the sickle vector types are just a pathway to achieve performance on the CPU. All right. So if you have like a legacy code, right, that you can't go in and rewrite the code from the ground up, especially like the MadGraph code where we have these million line kernels, you can kind of use this as a way to achieve performance on the CPU if you are limited to that capacity. So if you got to run on the CPU, this is a pathway to performance on the CPU. So let's talk about the kind of the workflow for running on HPC machine. So I already mentioned the inputs, the inputs and the outputs. So you give it the process you want to run, you generate the code, and then you compile it. And then we have some script where we submit it to our job scheduler, and we use MPI for pi basically in order to copy the binary of MadGraph to all the different nodes. And then we run individual versions of MadGraph on each rank on the machine. And then we use MPI for pi to collect all the results. And one thing I didn't mention is that the MadGraph application is an embarrassingly parallel application. So we're easily able to run it at scale, I guess, on a HPC machine. And the first thing we wanted to look at was, okay, so how does the sickle portion and of the code scale? So this is a sickle to sickle comparison. I know the colors are the same as I showed before for CUDA, but this is the sickle to sickle code. So the sickle code compiled on the NVIDIA devices. And it's steady up to the small number of node count we were able to have access to at the time when I ran these. So up to 64 nodes on Sunspot and up to 96 nodes on Polaris. One thing you might notice if you got a keen memory is that these results are slightly lower than the plots that I showed you before, which were here. So one thing is the full application, so the full scientific application is being run in this region of this plot. But another thing is the timers that we have around the kernels. In the Fortran side of the code also includes things like where we have to transpose the Fortran, the data in the Fortran code in order to get it into the way that's optimal on the GPU, as well as some other small pieces in the timing. So that's why the performance is slightly different between those. As far as the other parts of the workflow, they also seem to scale fine as well. There was some creeping in the moving and parsing and the initialization on Polaris up to 96 nodes, but it wasn't anything too large. And since I've collected this data, we had access to Aurora, and I was able to run the application at scale there as well. So I was able to run it up to a quarter of the system. So they allowed me to run it up to a quarter of the system. And so running it there, we were able to achieve 151 million events generated in under 5 minutes, which is pretty good. So in order for them to do that at CERN on the machines that they have, so on the CPU machines, they would have to use essentially the whole cluster they have. So they have to use 600,000 cores essentially to get the same result. And then they, of course, would be a nightmare having to copy and move all that stuff. So that doesn't include all of that. And actually scheduling the jobs, right? It'd be tough for them to schedule on the full cluster. So in conclusion, I just want to say that SYCL is great for portability, especially in the high energy physics realm. So, no matter what kind of system you have, if you write your code in SYCL, you'll be able to get decent performance. Especially, if it's a very complex code like MadGraph. So another thing is that I had mentioned was the sickle vector types as being a pathway to getting vectorization on the CPU. But I wouldn't rely on that behavior. So things might change in the future where that won't work, but it is one pathway to get there. And also the MATGRAPH code itself is able to scale efficiently on HPC machines. So with that, I guess I'll open the floor for any questions.
So this is more of a comment than a question, I guess. And you kind of hedged your bets at the end there, which I appreciated, but sickle vector types are not a guarantee of vectorization on CPUs.
Yeah, exactly.
It's implementation specific behavior that can change depending on the code.
Yeah, or even in the future, right? So like
Yeah.
right now it's working, but maybe in the future it won't work, right? So
But you could have a different code on a CPU implementation where it wouldn't vectorize in that dimension.
Yeah,
Because it
yeah,
could be
exactly,
heuristic
exactly.
guided and all kinds of things.
So, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, so that's one thing I wanted to stress, and I'm glad that James brought it up again. So this isn't reliable. You shouldn't rely on this behavior for performance, but it's one thing that you can check. I think a better approach might be using the eSIM-D extension, right, in order to try to get this to work. But
Okay, well now I have a question. Look, did you investigate the code generation to see why it may not have been automatically vectorizing it nicely? Like, why was intervention required?
I think we should talk about this after. I think I don't want to say anything about the compiler. But the kernel is very large, so it's very tough for the compiler to handle essentially. The right answer is that it should have been rewritten from the ground up, right? I think that if you recall the spaghetti graph that I had there, it seems like it's a good candidate for like CUDA graphs or SYCL graphs, right? That might be a better approach for this application in order to achieve performance. But sometimes you got to do things a certain way based on what the developers of the application want, right? So it's I'll leave it at that.
Do you think if there were any annotations that you could add to SYCL or anything that it could help?
I think if we can talk after, yeah. I'm not going to use the microphone as a soapbox, I guess. Let's move on.
Hi. So when you say that you're generating SYCL kernels with like a million lines of code, or what was it? I wonder, like, compile times are not traditionally a strength of SYCL. And is this something that you've noticed, and what is your experience there, especially compared to like the other backends that you have, like CUDA or so?
So we've been working closely with the Intel compiler team in order to get compile times down. So they've been really responsive in trying to get the compile times down for us. So we're actually really close to the compile times on CUDA, on Intel GPUs, and then also on NVIDIA GPUs.
Cool.
So obviously CodePlay as well there. So for the million line kernel, it's like 15 minutes. So it's not too bad. Originally, so I'll say originally it was much longer.
So are there any like strategies that you employ on your side to reduce it, or is it just optimizations on the compiler side of things?
In terms of getting compile time down, it's optimizations on the compiler side of things. But yeah, I've been trying to push the MATGRAPH development team to go in a different direction with the code, right? Obviously, million line kernels are not very sustainable in the GPU ecosystem.
Thank you for the interesting talk about, since you're a large domain science application, is there any a wish list for features that you would like SYCL to have that you didn't?
This kind of goes back to James' question as well. So it'd be good if we wrote something like, say, in like a hierarchical way, or even work group data parallel way, that we could generate a graph from that code, not necessarily having to go through and write the graphs themselves. I know there's an extension, or even if you have the directed acyclic graph of the event needs, right? We should be able to compile that because we already have the directed acyclic graph. Again, I haven't done too much with CUDA graphs and SYCL graphs. That might already be part of the extension. So I'm not going to talk too much about that.
So I'm still trying to wrap my head around like huge kernels like this, but do you have any idea if like registers are spilling into like global memory and
Oh yeah,
thing?
yeah,
Okay.
there's a major problem for this.
Okay.
Which is also another reason why we want to shrink the size of the kernel down. Right?
Okay.
So, and in fact, we suspect that that's where the major performance degradation is occurring with these more computationally complex problems, right?
Yeah.
So as we increase the computational complexity, we end up getting many more register spills, and so they're going, it's flushing everything to global memory and reading it back in, and the compiler doesn't seem to be handling it well, I guess, for at least on the AMD side and on the Intel side. So it's something that's being looked into, though. It's not like it's just sitting there.
Maybe just a note on this register spill. I guess in theory you should not spill, right? Because
Yeah.
in theory they are
The right
independent
perfect code,
function and they should not spill. The problem is like register allocation is a pretty complex stuff, right? The algorithm is not a ON1, and even if it was a ON1 in 1 million of code, so it's just the compiler give up trying to optimize anything, right? So I
Yeah,
think
exactly.
here, but it's not a compiler problem. I mean, it's a kernel problem. I think. It's not like you can really
Develop.
find the best placement. So I think, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm really appreciative of the compiler teams, like both CodePlay and Intel, like, putting the time in to fix such bad code.
Yes,
And this isn't my only app. I have other apps that are well written.
but yeah, it will be really interesting to see the CUDA graph approach with so many code, with so many dependencies. I think it will be really stress the dependency analysis and these kind of things. So I think it will be really a good thing, yeah. And you should be able to win a lot because you will have no more register spinning.
Yeah, exactly.
So even if you lose at the latency bound, you should still be able to win at the register speed.
And what's important is in the full application, we also reuse it like many times. So that's also useful for the graph as well, right?
So if you can go back to the OpenMP slide in the for the GPU, that's OpenMP target, right?
No, this is just on the CPU. It's not on the GPU.
Oh, right,
It
okay.
doesn't use any target offload.
And then SYCL here outperforms OpenMP. That's using your vectorization
Yes,
trick? Okay.
Yeah. So so on here, right, so on this bar plot, that's just the best result from these scale plots.
And you don't observe any NUMA effects because it's a compute bound application, I guess?
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
This one?
The line chart,
Okay, yes. So the single threaded or the multi-threaded?
multi-threaded. Yeah, that one. So how much of this do you think may not really be vectorization so much as just, especially on the left half of it, TBB versus OpenMP static scheduling?
So that part of it, yes, I think it's the scheduling. So you can look, if you look at the assembly, you'll see that it's using vectorized instructions and vector loads and stuff. So it's using an appropriate instruction set to achieve vectorization, essentially. One thing people didn't ask, but I'll point out. You may notice that for the simple one, the performance is much better on the CPU here. Whereas if you look at the ratio here, it's a lot closer. So if you investigate the assembly, you'll see that the performance difference, the big performance difference there was it was getting stuck in the OpenMP side and loop control instructions. But the rest was so using the SYCL code, we were able to avoid that loop control instruction. I didn't show the simple ones here because I didn't think it was a very fair comparison because of that. The performance for the OpenMP is much worse.